Hey, thanks everyone for tuning. And astrologer and prolific writer Charlie Obert has joined me today to talk about his recently released book, Saturn Through the Ages. Uh, Hello, Charlie. Thanks for joining.
Thank you very much for asking me, Ashwin. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So you published. I mean, let's just talk about other books of yours a little bit and come back to this book because I think you have published 5 books, including this, right?
Correct. Saturn is the fifth one. And the first books, especially the first three of them, are essentially meant to be an overall introduction to traditional Western astrology for people who are new to it. I
Okay.
think of the first three as kind of like a series.
Okay. So, and the fourth book is uh, the Lot of Fortune and Spirit, right?
Right. Study just on the use of the lots of fortune and spirit because they get talked about in traditional astrology, but I've never seen them used in a lot of detail. I decided to concentrate on just those. So yeah, it's a pretty in-depth study just on those 2 points. So that one's getting a bit more advanced. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. And you're the topic of today, Saturn through the ages. So I was quite fortunate enough to kind of read this book. Of course, I follow your blog, so I know whenever you publish a book or something like that. So I purchased the book, and I was immediately struck by the amount of material that you have given just about Saturn. So I've read one more book about Saturn, which was by Robert Wilkinson, which was also a very
Okay.
wonderful book in its own way. And this one kind of, um, I don't think anyone has compiled a lot of material that has been written across history in terms of meaning of Saturn. So signification of Saturn itself is a debatable topic and a controversial one. If people kind of go back to history and come to modern times, and
Yes.
I think you have done a very useful job of comparing how Saturn has been perceived across traditions from the first century common era to current periods, and you also mentioned a lot of authors, and you have cited so many works about how other astrologers have written about Saturn. So uh, yeah, so you have categorized the book into 3 parts,
Right.
and the first part, of course, is it's a it's completely about signification of Saturn from for since the past 2000 years, and then you go on to talk about why Saturn has been perceived in so and so way, and why you are kind of attached to a specific ideology about Saturn and meaning of Saturn, and your own philosophical underpinnings based upon Plato's philosophy. And then you move on to talk about Saturn's essays. So uh, maybe we can just talk about significations of Saturn as a basic idea for this for this session, and see what happens, and then go on
Yes.
to the next parts if
Yes.
time permits, and see how it travels.
Very good.
So
Yeah.
I just want to make it an organic discussion and see how things go. So let's begin with how come you got an idea of Saturn. You mentioned elsewhere as well that Saturn is your favorite planet. This is not the first place you're mentioning it. So I just thought we can talk
Right.
about.
Yeah. It's been I mean,
Yeah, go on, please.
sure. Yeah, I imagine astrologers have this. Different astrologers are fascinated with different planets, right? Saturn's Lord of my chart. I have Capricorn rising.
Uh-huh.
And part of the reason I wrote it is just that a lot of the depth of the meaning of Saturn in traditional astrology has been lost and thinned out in modern astrology. It's lost a lot of complexity of its meaning. So what I tried to do in the first part of the book, it's essentially a historical survey. And I'm quoting from quite a few astrologers in the traditional era, which is from Vettius Valens up all the way through William Lilly. And you see there's a consistency of meaning given to Saturn through that whole period. Then you come to the modern period, and there's a lot of things that changed.
Sure.
And what I wanted to do is go back to the early meanings and recover some of the complexity and the depth of it. The latter parts of the book, which we're probably not going to go into detail, is part of the reason the meaning of Saturn has changed is that the world we live in has changed. We think about things differently. We have a different outlook on the world. So when we look out at the night sky, we don't see the same sky that people saw 1,000 years ago.
Yeah.
I wanted to recover some of the sense of the traditional worldview also, because I think Saturn makes more sense in that context.
I think this was one of the final things that I wanted to touch up, but since you brought up, let's just finish it off in that area in terms of how does it really make sense to kind of modify the significations of a planet just because the age and the world has changed and come far ahead 2,000 years since Vettius Valens lived?
Okay. Well, I think what I would say is that are recovering a lot of the traditional meanings still apply today.
Exactly.
But in the process of recovering those meanings, we really need to think about how we think about the universe and how we think about our place in the universe. Because Saturn's got a very special place in the traditional world there.
Yeah. So, just to kind of touch upon briefly and see what Vettius Valens talks about, because Valens seems to be the first source of traditional material that you have mentioned. So,
right.
So I was thinking like Saturn makes those born under him petty, malignant, careworn, self-depreciating, solitary, deceitful, secretive in their trickery, strict, downcast, with a hypocritical air, squalid, black-clad, importunate, sad-looking, miserable, with a nautical bent, plying waterside trades, and and then you talk about humblings, sluggishness, unemployment, obstacles in business, interminable lawsuits, subversion of business, secrets, imprisonment, chains, griefs, accusations, tears, bereavement, capture, exposures of children. And it's difficult for me to deny that everything of these makes sense in today's world as well.
Right. Yeah, it's very part of the reading traditional texts, and you notice that too. It doesn't start with one or two keywords. It's a catalog of all kinds of meanings. But if you go through even those couple sentences you quoted out of Valens, a lot of the main themes of Saturn are there already, if you really look at them and think about them, right?
Yeah.
It's talking about it being solitary, secretive. Those are very Saturnian sort of traits. Saturn being in black, sad looking. There's a melancholy side to Saturn. That's there already, right?
Yeah.
And in that second section where you're talking about humbling, sluggishness, etc., this talking about Saturn as things that block things, slow down things, get in the way. So there's an awful lot in that description of Valens that's really, really rich if you take the time to really read it and think about them all.
Yeah.
Which is part of what I was trying to do at first.
Exactly. So I think modern astrology has been very resisting towards the more blunt side of planetary significations from traditional astrology, because to talk about interminable lawsuits, secrets, imprisonment, accusations, griefs, etc., are really strong words that that kind of trouble a client or even a psychological astrologer of today, because they don't want to use any of these words to their clients. So they don't want to they probably want to sugarcoat a lot of these things. I'm not trying to criticize anything here, but I think there is a lot of sugarcoating that is happening. So
I agree with you.
Yeah.
I
So
totally agree with you.
yeah. So there is a lot of sugarcoating that happens um, in the way astrology is being done. Uh, so that I think it becomes challenging for those people to kind of accommodate these strict and very tough words that traditional astrologers give, not just valence, but most of the traditional astrologers, not just in Western astrology but also in Indian astrology. but
Yep.
but but from a realistic point of view, I think all those things make sense even today. So
Well,
imprisonment
they
is not.
absolutely do. Right. Look around what's going on in the world today. It's not pretty,
Yeah,
you
so
know?
it's.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's kind of a bluntness, this kind of a rawness
Yeah,
to those early descriptions. And they're also very, very concrete, you know?
yeah,
And I agree with you. Modern astrology, number one, it tends to start with just a couple keywords that kind of get simplified. But you're right, modern astrology tries, or in a lot of cases, tends to want to put a positive spin on things.
exactly.
And there's an awful lot of meanings of Saturn that it's really hard to put a positive spin on.
Yeah, I mean there are certain things or certain areas in astrology where when we talk about negative things, it's just explicitly negative, and it's
Yep.
difficult to kind of impose a positive shadow to over it. So
Yes.
you talk about a specific part, I think, which is called as positive thinking and new thought. So I wanted to kind of touch upon that area. Uh, Quickly, not quickly, maybe we can just talk about it for a few minutes, because I think it is a very
Sure.
important thing that you have addressed in the book. uh, so do you think you just want to talk about what you mean by positive thinking and new thought? It's a lot about what we spoke
Sure.
just now, but yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Let me kind of back up, put a context in that. Yeah. What I did, putting that into the context of the book, first part of the book, I was covering the traditional authors. And then when talking about the 20th century writers, I wanted to talk about, well, what kind of world are they coming out of that they're creating their astrology from? And one of the very big influences on the 20th century, especially things like 20th century astrology, pardon me, is a movement in the late 1800s, early 1900 that was sometimes called New Thought.
New age movement.
Right. It's kind of the predecessor of the New Age.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And it was very much a period, this was a period of just in America and Europe of just unparalleled growth, unparalleled prosperity, that kind of thing. And the feeling was we're really starting to understand the power of the human mind to shape things. So if we think positive, we can make this all a positive world. That's had a huge influence on the New Age movement, on modern astrology, and just on modern culture in general.
Sure.
And part of what I wanted to do in this book is to step back and go, okay, this is part of the world we grew up in, and we need to rethink this
No.
because there's things about it that work well, and there's real problems with it too. You know?
Yeah.
That's where, like, when you started out reading the quotes from Valens,
Yeah.
I mean, very obviously, Valens was not trying to put a positive spin on Saturn, you know, but
Yeah.
he was describing this is how this planet actually works out in a couple ways, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And part of what, this is where I think traditional has a lot to complement modern astrology with, is coming to terms with just some of the really, really difficult parts of human life on this earth, you know?
Mm.
And it especially, I think, is useful. And part of the reason that positive thinking and that positive outlook in the world could catch on is that it was during a period of so much growth and so much prosperity. Things looked like they were just, this was brave new world. We'd conquered the last of science and we were going to, you know, get rid of poverty, disease, and everything else. You need a different kind of astrology when you're dealing with a world where that just doesn't make sense anymore.
Mm.
where you're dealing with the fact that things go wrong, that very obviously we still have disease.
Yeah.
We have, and in terms of humans too, we have aging, you know, but also in terms of human, there's a lot of Saturnian, even in a psychological sense, there's Saturnian traits that aren't pretty. We get
Sure.
stubborn, we get secretive, we block things, we hinder, we obstruct, we hide things, you know? We need both sides. We need the full complexity of the meaning of the planet to make sense of all of our world.
Sure. And I just wanted to quickly clarify one thing, because um, it's not that you're critiquing modern astrology. I think this book is I mean, the portion you deal with you also deal with kind of reconciling both modern and traditional ways of perceiving Saturn, and you don't necessarily put a critique on modern astrology or something like that. I think it's a very I think it was very adeptly handled, and was one of the interesting things kind of while I was kind of reading the book across the midway. So
Thank you.
yeah,
Yeah, I very much wanted to say that there's a lot of good things about modern astrology.
yeah. I mean, let's
Don't want to deny
quickly
it.
talk about that, because you also talk about contribution of modern astrology. So I think it goes on towards the
Right,
middle of the book. Yeah, contribution of modern
right,
astrology in terms of
right. And you know what I think the single big thing about that, and this is something you really don't see in traditional, and yet we're so used to it. In traditional astrology, if you read an awful lot of the descriptions of Valens all the way through William and Lilly, they're all about what is going to happen. They're concrete things. Modern astrology, its strength is very much asking the why questions. It's the questions of meaning, of purpose, that kind of thing. That's a whole new dimension of astrology. And it is developed in modern astrology in a way that it just isn't in traditional. And I don't want to lose that. I think we need both. We need the concreteness. We need the acknowledgement of where life is, where it gets messy, where it gets ugly, it gets hard. But also we need that, not just what am I doing here, but why am I here? You know? That's where the psychological dimension of modern astrology is very, very useful. I agree with you on that one.
Yeah, I think it was it was very interesting to see the balance of bringing in both modern and traditional ways, because we also deal with some of the evolutionary astrology significations in this book, and you already wrote an earlier article which is also a part of this book called Plato and Reincarnation. So
right.
So it's you also kind of recognize some of the very valuable stuff that's available in modern astrology, irrespective of its form. So
absolutely. Yeah. Modern astrology does not have a monopoly on the whole notion of reincarnation of multiple lives.
Yeah.
And it's obviously part of the Eastern tradition, but it's part of the Western tradition also. That was part of my point there. Yeah.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, sometime in the late 19th century and early 20th century, or even before that, so there was this New Age movement where a few people got acquainted with a lot of Eastern philosophy and tried to apply the concept of reincarnation and karma in Western astrology, and kind of merged with the esoteric astrological tradition that was pretty much existent during the early 20th century, which kind of uh, ignited the revival of astrology itself, because there was no explicit astrology practiced for the 200 years, even though it must have been behind the scenes. So that is one of the most important things if we talk about history, but still which turned out to be like it kind of diverted from what Eastern philosophy talks about, the idea of reincarnation and karma, and then they took it on an entirely different way, where they talk about the evolution of the soul. But in Eastern astrology, soul is omnipresent, and it just has one, one. Uh, I don't know how to even put it. So it just has one form. Okay, so
Hmm.
it just does not change. Soul is omnipresent and it just stays there. But evolutionary astrologers consider that soul evolves
Hmm.
as and when kind of we take rebirths over and again,
Right.
which is not something that I could resonate with,
Hmm.
because none of the Vedanta talks about evolution of the soul. It just talks about evolution of human mind.
Right.
So
Yeah. And, part of what I think went on there, and this is a very late 1800, is what you had is interest in Eastern religion and Eastern philosophy coming into a society that was just discovering Charles Darwin.
mm, sure.
And it combined, right? It combined the two.
Mm,
I think that's part of what happened. Yeah.
yeah.
But then part of something that got tied in with that, and this is talking about the modern attitude too, is if you take the Eastern, multiple lives and that kind of thing, and then you add in evolution, you get this whole notion of the progress of the soul, right?
Mm,
That it's always moving forward and upward and that kind of thing. It's kind of a mix of ideas that's very, very characteristic of the time.
yeah, sure.
And as you know, as in both the West and in the East, as you know, even if you're talking reincarnation, it's definitely not just a simple matter of a linear progression.
Yeah,
In
yeah.
fact,
Nothing is really linear in that way.
right, right. In fact, in the Plato's
Mm,
presentation, which is basically the fullest form of it, is in Book 10 of the Republic, what's called the Myth of Ar. His presentation of the multiple lives is much more up and down and up and down. That
mm.
you're much likely after a good life where you've had kind of a good past life, you're kind of complacent, you get sloppy in the next life. But then when you have a really bad life and you've had kind of a, I don't want to say punishing, but I'll say corrective in between life, then you're likely to be a lot more careful in the next. So you don't really have evolution, you sort of have this kind of thing. Back
Yeah,
and
ups and
forth,
downs.
and that kind of thing. Right.
Okay, so the part of this topic precisely is because uh, Saturn is considered to be the planet of karma, or whatever you may want to call it. So,
All right.
so the
Or
theory,
you
yeah,
could, in Western terms, in Eastern, they'd say karma. In Western, you might say either fate
uh-huh,
or providence, or what I guess you could call, and this is another big part of Saturn, is law in the larger sense. That what we
yeah,
do has consequences. And Saturn's all about consequences.
sure.
Saturn is where you pay the piper at the end.
Okay, so Saturn is a planet of law. So I think it's agreed across various traditions. So I think it's time for us to get into actual core significations and see how historically Saturn has been treated. So since you just mentioned, let's talk about Saturn as a planet of law. You clearly mentioned that um, we are all bound by what we do, and we have to face the consequences, whether if it is good or
Right.
bad. So
Right.
Saturn becomes an inherent planet of law and justice. So yeah,
Yes.
just
And you notice something important about what you said there, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is part of the Eastern tradition,
uh,
is this is law, not just in a physical sense, but it's law in a moral sense. That it's like, and
that's
I
right.
think this is part of karma also. There is a moral law built into the very structure of the universe.
Yes,
And that's part of what Saturn, if you will, echoes or mirrors in our world.
sure. I
That
think
we're always
Saturn rules.
living, yeah,
No, no, please go on.
okay, yeah, that part of Saturn, and I use, it's in the title, the metaphor, I say between time and eternity. We live in two worlds at once. We live in the world of time, we live in the world of where things change, and there's parts of us that change. At the same time, there's an eternal dimension
Hmm?
to our lives. And we're constantly living in that dimension. And I'd be tempted to say we're constantly measured by that dimension. That
Yeah,
when you're dealing with Saturn, you're dealing with how do my actions reflect in eternity, you know? It's a very sobering and severe, and at the same way, really beautiful kind of perspective. This whole notion that all my actions are constantly within the context of a moral law, that I am constantly, not just afterlife, but in life, I'm constantly judged by moral law.
yeah, sure, yeah. Are we kind of, always stoic when we talk about Saturn?
Stoic's part of it, for
Yeah,
sure.
because it's difficult for me.
Right, because part of what Stoicism, and by the way, I adore the Stoics.
Yeah, so yeah, me too. Yeah,
Right. And also the Stoics are really, really useful right now, because part of Stoicism is coming to terms with the fact that there's all kinds of things out of your control.
yeah,
And the one thing you have control over is your response.
sure.
And Saturn is very good at reminding you of where you don't control this anymore. Your control stops here. There are limits. Saturn's all about limits.
Yeah.
And
Sure.
you have the responsibility for choosing how do you deal with those limits.
And
Yeah, go ahead. You're going to say something.
No, just go ahead.
Okay, yeah. And see, the nice thing about that is that if you come to terms with the fact that, okay, there are things in my life that by definition are out of my control, and I have to accept that, and then choose, how can I respond in such a way, how do I want to put this, that is, if you will, both most fruitful for me and fruitful for the universe. It's like, how do I fit within the law of the universe?
That's it.
I think that's an awful lot of what Saturn is all about.
Sure. So, yeah, I think we can just move on to the basic significations. But, we didn't mean to talk about the Platonic model and universal patterns, but I think it was imperative for us to kind of touch over that when we talk about Saturn. So I'm really glad that you spoke about the universal patterns and structures from where we all kind of evolve and also be present at the same time. So we are all ruled by a specific structure and a specific, I won't say force, but a pattern or something like that we are, indefinitely bound to. So, so
Right.
eventually we had to touch upon that. Yeah.
Right. The world is not just this raw material out there that I can do whatever I want with.
Yes.
The entire cosmos has structure. And this is, I think, a big difference between traditional and modern. Modern tends to think very much of, okay, it's my world, what am I going to do with it? And traditional, and this is a lot of where Saturn fits in, it's the structure of the entire cosmos, which includes the cosmos, which includes the world, which includes society, which includes government and everything. And it's, where do I fit within all that? It's a larger order that spans multiple levels.
Sure. Okay, the next thing that I have on my list is just we'll go on to the general significance. We already spoke about, you spoke about what Saturn means towards the beginning of the show, and we also quoted a little bit of balance. And let's just move on to sect and how Saturn works based upon the sect of its, based upon the sect of the chart. So Firmicus Maternus gives a lot of significance to the sect, and you also talk about that in the book, and how Saturn behaves and how Saturn's basic significations kind of have an altering flavor based upon the sect in which they are placed.
Right, very much. And just kind of putting a frame of that, since not all modern astrologers know that concept, that one of the very big concepts in traditional astrology is, as you said, sect, is this a day chart and is this a night chart? And there are day planets and there are night planets.
Yeah.
Saturn is traditionally a day planet. And this means that Saturn tends to be a lot easier to deal with if you have a chart where you were born during the day, and a lot harder to deal with if you have a chart where you're born at night. I found that in my own life, I found that in other people's lives. We often look at Saturn returns, right?
Yeah.
Saturn returns are almost always a lot more difficult for people who were born at night. That's not 100% of the time, but it's a very, very high percentage of the time. Night charts have way more difficulty, Saturn returns in general than day charts do. And that's part of it, yeah.
Yeah, I think Formicus lays out a lot of emphasis on that, and you also talk about it in the book. So I mean, I've seen live example of Saturn in the 8th house for a day chart and Saturn in the 8th house for a night chart, where one person has Saturn as the 10th lord in the 8th house and is able to kind of keep intact the job and a little bit of regular income, while the other person who has a night chart with same Saturn as the 10th lord in this 8th house for the same rising is facing a difficult time to stick on to one job and has already switched over 10 to 12 professions and is struggling to kind of make something out of the 10th house. So it's important to kind of consider the sect of the chart and see how planets play, not just Saturn.
Yes, very much. And the very early traditional astrology put a very, very heavy emphasis on sect. You mentioned the text that I quote from Firmicus Maternity. They're very, very extreme. Well, it's the difference between day and night.
Yes.
If you got a day chart, there's going to be all these good things that are going to happen. If you got a night chart, it's going to be horrible. And it's the two extremes.
Yeah.
I don't think it's quite that extreme in the full context, because there's other things to take into account, like the other dignities. But in a lot of ways, yeah, everything else being equal, Saturn's a lot more awful in a night chart than it is in a day chart.
Sure.
And it helps to know that, it helps to deal with that. I know that one from experience. I have a night chart. My Saturn return was horrible.
Okay.
It was 3 of the hardest years of my life,
Okay.
I'm writing a book about Saturn, right? So I'm kind of paying him back.
So you are kind of talking out of experience. So.
Oh yeah. No, this is a chart being ruled by Saturn. We tend to be late bloomers, right? I wrote my first book when I was age 65.
Okay, but you already wrote 5 books, and you're almost prolific now, and I'm sure you're also on your way to kind of do another. So
no, actually, I'll mention, I'm working on a book now that like that the first part of this book, just the historical traditional survey. I'm working on a book where I'm doing that for all of the planets. Just the traditional survey, just 4 of the traditional authors. To again, amazing. Start to recover the richness, and I'm going to call it the rawness of the traditional meanings of Saturn, and do that by confronting the early texts and really think about them. And that's what I try to do in depth with the Saturn book.
Sure. I think it's going to be a very interesting book. So next is kind of Saturn's cold nature, dry nature, and melancholic nature, darkishness, harshness. Right. So I just wanted to talk about a little bit of dark, cold, and moist, where in which comes in the chapter of Abu Mashar and his version of Saturn's, meanings.
Right. So yeah, it's interesting because there's kind of 2 different, I'll call them threads in the early material, that when Saturn really started to get systematized, when you had the whole system of the humors, where you had things either being warm or cold and either dry or moist.
Mm.
Once that system categorized, Saturn within that system was considered to be cold and dry. And you see that a lot in the meanings of Saturns. But if you go back to the really early authors like Valens, and the tracks are still there in Abu Mashar, before that categorization got too rigid, you're constantly seeing Saturn talked about as being cold and damp, cold and wet. I think of it kind of being like a wet bank, like a wet basement.
I think it's one of those important reasons why Saturn is considered to be a day chart, where Ptolemy gives the rationale as to day chart already has a lot of fire in it, while Saturn adds the balancing effect with its cold and dry nature.
Exactly. And that coldness at night with Saturn is so much more extreme than it is during the day, where, like you said, it's compensated for by the heat. Yeah. But you'll see in the very earliest text, despite Saturn overall being talked about cold and dry, it'll constantly talk about cold and moist, land by rivers, underground water, that kind of thing. And I think of it as kind of being, you know, that, like I said, kind of a wet, cold bankment where it's kind of clammy and it doesn't feel clean and mold is growing and that kind of thing. That's Saturn. Distinctly unhealthy, dark, cold, damp, underground, that kind of thing. A kind of atmosphere where things rot.
Marshlands.
Yes, marshlands, exactly. And that would be also, these are not terribly healthy places to hang out. And that's part of Saturn too. So yeah, and that's definitely part of it. And Saturn, if you would talk about that in terms of, you know, how that could affect humans, that Saturnian sorts of illnesses or problems could be problems from being cold and dark and damp, you know? Yeah, I think we kind of explained that one.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so slavery is something that's it's you know, one of the raw and also difficult sides of Saturn, and slavery is not new. So of course slavery, so slavery is pretty much Saturnian.
Right. And again, Saturn, where you're bumping up against Saturn, is the places where you're not in control. Where either someone else is controlling you, or like with slavery, which is extreme, someone else owns you, or where you are constrained by circumstances. So like, even, you know, part of what's going on now, Saturn is very strong now. We had that horrible triple conjunction of Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, all in Capricorn, with Saturn, Mars really strong and Jupiter really weak. And now Saturn's really, really strong in Aquarius. And what's going on? We're all locked in, right? That's Saturnian.
Exactly, yeah.
It's very, very Saturnian.
Yeah, current situation is pretty much Saturnian.
Right. It's where it gets really ugly is it's a combination of Saturn and Mars, where there's no Jupiter around to help out.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, but yeah, that's Saturn.
Sure. So I think Saturn is. Let's not just talk about. It gets difficult for me to kind of talk about only bad things. I mean, not bad, but you know, harsh things about Saturn. So let's talk about how Saturn becomes a taskmaster, and how Saturn becomes a religious, how Saturn can turn out to bring out one of the most important people in terms of religious upbringing of a specific century or something like that, because ninth house deals with religious matters, and 12th house also deals with deep spirituality and all those things. So so if Saturn is kind of associated with these houses, or if Saturn rules the chart, you know, the
I guess,
Capricorn or Aquarius rising, I think it becomes important for those people to kind of have a higher thinking in a very rigid and a uh, kind of circled manner where they set their own boundaries in terms of talking about religion, and they don't kind of look beyond what they think. So, which is also one side of Saturn. So, Saturn kind of brings in a lot of religious masters, right?
yes. And a lot of the religious qualities of Saturn are precisely the kind of things. Saturn's associated with old age, right?
Mm.
Saturn is age. That the positive sides of Saturn, in terms of wisdom, in terms of spirituality, is the wisdom of age. It's the kind of things you learn from having been around for a while.
Yeah.
And having gone through a lot, and some of it's good and some of it's not good. So and part of the wisdom of age is dealing with good times and bad times and things going great and things going horrible, and somehow you keep going. And also Saturn is all about, if you want to talk about positive side of Saturn, it's the gifts that come to you out of the really, really hard stuff.
Exactly. Yeah, sure.
And in a lot of ways, it's the, what is positive, what is negative. If I look back in my life, in a lot of ways, the most horrible experiences at the time were some of the areas where I grew the most, or where I learned the most, or I got the most out of it. So it's Saturn is the wisdom, and Saturn is the acceptance, and I'd even call it a sort of compassion that comes out of dealing with hard times, dealing with age, dealing with things falling apart, dealing with sickness, dealing with death.
Yeah.
There's a depth to it, there's a beauty to it, and there's a real, again, in a Saturn sort of way, there's a strength to it. And the other thing that's related to that's very, very Saturn, that our culture is not good at all, patience.
Patience, yeah.
Because Saturn is all about time, the long run, the very, very, very long run.
Sure.
And this even ties into what we were talking about with, where we were talking about Saturn in terms of context of eternal law and multiple lifetimes. Saturn is all about, when I come to the end of my life, what am I bringing into the next life? What have I learned? What have I gotten? What about my experience is permanent? That's Saturn too.
Sure.
Did that feel right?
And that's perfect. And that kind of pretty much explains what you have mentioned in the book in various places. And you also talk about how, Saturn and Jupiter kind of do the same things and also relate to same things at the same time, where religion and philosophy and religious teachers and philosophical teachers can be related to Jupiter as well. So,
right.
You talk about it in a small paragraph in a book where how Saturn and Jupiter kind of gel together in terms of working with their significations and so on. So
right.
that was
and
also,
they can complement each other. Yeah.
Yeah.
And by the way, just kind of side comment that we're talking about patience and that kind of thing. I think it's fairly obvious from what we're talking about here. This book we're talking about is not a book you're going to read through quickly.
I totally agree with especially the philosophical area of the book, which is the second part of the book, which might not form the core part of today's discussion, but for sure in future. So sure. I think this is I think people should just hold this book and read it for just like what Saturn signifies, time. Just take your time and just go on.
Right. And it is, again, in a Saturnian sort of way, it's also the kind of learning that you can't rush through.
Sure.
It's and a Saturn sort of, say, spiritual discipline, pardon me, would be something that involves stillness, involve patience, And in terms of learning, we use the word a bit different in Western and Eastern. If you talk about meditation in the traditional Western sense, it's less like stilling your mind, and it's more like thinking very slowly and deeply about things and thinking them all the way through. That's Saturnian, getting to the depth of things, if you will.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So, I think we also touched upon a little bit of mundane stuff. Do you want to talk about a little bit of mundane stuff in terms of what Saturn signifies? I think limitations and the overall universal pattern in terms of how Saturn puts us all in one grind and puts us into difficult times and all those things are pretty much Saturnian. So jail is largely related to Saturn, and in Vedic astrology, we can also relate jail with the North Node. So there are various, similarities and differences always exist. So do you want to talk about a little bit of mundane stuff?
Yeah, and part of Saturn here also with this, and I think this relates to mundane, it relates what we're doing here. Saturn's time. And Saturn is the consequences of time. And part of time, I hope my hand's visible here, time is not a straight line. Time is cycles.
Yeah.
And part of Saturn is realizing that when there's an upturn, there's going to be a downturn. That things are going to grow, but things are going to decay. You're going to be on the way up, you're going to be on the way down. And it's dealing with the whole cycle.
Yeah. So which kind of pretty much takes us to death from an individual's point of view. So Saturn is also the significator of longevity, or in other words, death. So if you want to talk from the positive sense, it's longevity. If you want to talk about the truth, it's death. So Saturn opens the doors into the other world.
Right. And an awful lot of Saturn is, if you will, where you pay the piper. It's where things get tested.
Yeah.
And if you build things well, you get rewarded. If you got sloppy or you got careless, you didn't do it well or whatever, then it's going to fall apart. Sure. It's the paying your dues. But you talked about mundane sense also. In mundane, Saturn also has a lot to do with power and control and older institutions, ones that have been around for a long time, and institutions where tradition has been passed down. That's part of Saturn too, because Saturn is also, those are controlled and those who are doing the controlling. Yeah. Saturn could be the slaves and the slave owners both.
Yeah, slave owners, yes, exactly, yeah.
Right. There's a lot to it. And both Saturn and Jupiter have that control factor, the group factor. Jupiter tends to be, well, Jupiter is one of the benefics, so it's where things are growing, coming together, doing well. Saturn is more running up against the limitations or running into the hard times or that kind of thing.
Perfect. So I think we spoke about a lot of significations about Saturn. And
right. It's a very, very rich topic. Yeah.
Yeah, and pretty much we covered whatever I wanted to cover with part 1, and we also touched upon a little bit of part 2. So
fantastic.
Yeah. So maybe sorry.
No, just there's one little piece I'd like to add that's a big kind of piece of the traditional that I think might be a good piece for the wrap on.
Sure.
The other part of the definition of Saturn, if you look at the rulerships, Saturn is opposite the lights.
Exactly, yeah.
That's right. So Saturn's all about opposition between day, night, life, death, and so on. And a lot of the meanings of Saturn come out of those oppositions, which is an awful lot of what astrology is built on there. So Saturn as opposition is kind of a core meaning. Saturn is cold is one of the core meanings. Saturn as law is one of the core meanings. Saturn as time and the consequences of time. Take those and mix them all together and meditate on them for about 50 years, and you get an idea what's going on with Saturn.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly said. So, I'm just glad that you mentioned about Saturn ruling the opposite signs
Yep.
from the lights. So I think that's a very good point, and it would have not been good if you had missed it. So I'm just so glad that you mentioned it. So
Fantastic.
yeah. So do you have something else to talk about Saturn, and or did you think
Oh,
we missed something?
No, I
Which you
think
mentioned
that's
about?
enough to get started,
Yeah.
because part of what we are getting at here is it's not just a simple subject where you can go, oh, Saturn's means this. It's
Yeah.
a complex network of meanings, and it ends up tying in all kinds of things. And what it will also tie in, which is a topic for a whole other night, is it's related to a whole way of looking at the world that's
For sure.
very different from our modern way, and in some ways brings qualities in that we very much need in our modern world to deal with the kind of things we're dealing with now.
Sure, and I think it will be a rich thing, and it will be a rich topic to discuss the Platonistic philosophy and its influence on not just Saturn but almost all those surrounding areas of astrology and
Oh,
see.
absolutely.
Yeah,
It's
I think,
it's the it's the entire context of astrology. I'm
yeah,
very, very fond of the Platonist worldview, and I think it has a lot to offer us in the modern world.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
And
very much.
as you spoke about in the second part of the book, where uh, it's just essential for us to understand that Saturn rules grammar and Saturn rules structures and Saturn rules the pattern of this cosmic setup. So I think that will be a perfect place to kind of wrap up this session and see what we have to take on in the next, and we'll plan out
Yes,
something, because I think I really enjoyed this discussion. It
I
was
did too.
fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
And
yeah.
Saturn rules, endings of all things, even good discussions.
Yeah, we have to kind of bring this to a close here, and
Exactly.
let's just quickly talk about your academic works and your website. I think it's studentafofastrology.com, right?
Studentafofastrology.com, yes. And all my books are out there. My books are available in print, but also out in studentafofastrology.com. They're all available as downloads
Yeah.
also. Yeah.
So yeah,
And I have an
it's good.
occasional blog too. So
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Cool. So I think that brings us towards the end of this discussion, and we'll see you next time.
Yes. Ashwin, thank you. It's been
Thank
a
you.
good conversation.
Thanks.